To the elite circles of Seoul, Neria Cole was the crown jewel of a dark empire. When she walked beside the Korean Mafia boss, Jin-seok, the world saw a masterpiece of devotion. At galas, his hand was a constant, heavy warmth against the small of her back, a gesture so steady in practice that it appeared effortless. They arrived as one, sat close enough for their shoulders to brush, and shared quiet, whispered exchanges that spectators mistook for secrets of the heart. In the flash of the cameras, it looked like absolute possession. To Neria, it was nothing more than a high-stakes dance. 18 months of marriage, and the man who claimed her so fiercely in the light of day had never once reached for her in the dark. Not a single finger had brushed her skin behind the heavy oak doors of their home. To the public, she was his world. In private, she was a ghost in a gilded cage. The divide between their two lives had become a physical border, a line Jin-seok drew at the threshold of the penthouse and refused to cross. Neria stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights of Seoul washing over her profile in shades of neon and shadow. She wore one of his loose white shirts, soft, unarmored, and painfully intimate against her skin. It was a silent invitation he never accepted. She stood perfectly still, her posture the picture of a woman who had learned that expecting nothing was the only way to survive the silence. Below the penthouse, the city was alive with messy, unscripted passion. Up here, everything was filtered and frozen. The door clicked. She didn't have to look. His presence always preceded him. A scent of expensive sandalwood and the sudden, heavy pressure of a man who commanded every room he entered. "You should be sleeping," Jin-seok said. His voice was low and precise, a velvet blade that cut through the quiet. "The bed is too big to sleep in alone," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of familiar resignation. She didn't turn to face him. Silence followed, thick and suffocating. When she finally looked back, she saw him, the man the underworld feared and the upper world envied. He stood several steps away, dressed in a crisp white shirt, his jaw severe and his eyes unreadable. He had an unfair beauty, the kind of face that belonged on a statue, cold and immovable. "We have the foundation dinner tomorrow," he stated, his hands in his pockets, his posture immaculate. "The car will be ready at 8. "We," she echoed softly, a bitter smile touching her lips. "We are so good at being we when people are watching. Don't you ever get tired of the act, Jin-seok?" He didn't blink. "It isn't an act. It's a requirement." "Pretending we share a life?" she pressed, her eyes searching his for a single crack in the mask. "Pretending that when the lights go out, you actually want me?" For a fraction of a second, his gaze flickered. It was the only admission he would ever give. Jin-seok had built his empire on the belief that power demanded boundaries. To him, distance wasn't cruelty, it was a shield. He performed the role of the devoted husband flawlessly because public touch was strategy. It marked her as his and kept the wolves at bay. But private touch? Private touch was truth. He knew that if he ever allowed himself to cross that room, if he let himself feel the warmth of her skin or the rhythm of her breath, he would be lost. To love her openly was to give his enemies a map to his only weakness. So he watched her from the shadows of the hallway, his heart a battlefield of desire and ironclad discipline. He let her believe he didn't want her, because the alternative, letting her know she was the only thing that could destroy him, was a risk he couldn't afford to take. By the end of the first year, Neria had stopped asking why. She had learned to bleed quietly in the silence, never realizing that while her husband was busy guarding the door, he was leaving the window open for someone else to climb in. Welcome back to Seoul Syndicate Stories. Thank you if you are just joining us. Before we continue, please subscribe to this channel, click the notification bell so you never miss any story, give thumbs up, and share with others. Tell me where you're watching from. It is always beautiful to see Seoul Syndicate Stories family stretch across the world. Every one of your clicks, your comments, and every bit of love you show helps us to keep uncovering these unforgettable stories together. Find a serene place to settle in, and let me take you somewhere you've probably never been before. Thanks for watching. The gala for the Seoul Children's Foundation was a masterclass in strategic affection. In the grand ballroom of the Shilla, beneath the weight of crystal chandeliers and the heavy gaze of the city's elite, Jin-seok was a man who seemed utterly consumed by his wife. His hand never left Neria's person. It was a constant, grounding presence at the small of her back, his thumb tracing slow, absent-minded circles against the silk of her dress. To the politicians and businessmen flanking them, It was the touch of a man who found his only peace in her proximity. Neria played her part with the practiced grace of a seasoned performer. She leaned into his side, her head tilted toward his shoulder, as he spoke of maritime logistics and urban development. When he laughed, a rare, low sound that never quite reached his eyes, she smiled against his arm, the picture of a woman cherished. Every flash of a camera captured a singular narrative. The ruthless head of the Kong syndicate had been softened by the woman at his side. But Neria could feel the tension vibrating through his palm. She knew that the warmth of his hand was a biological fact, not an emotional choice. It was the same heat that radiated from a furnace, contained, directed, and lethal if the door was ever opened. The ride back to the penthouse was conducted in a silence, so thick it felt like a third passenger. The moment the armored sedan pulled into the private garage, the choreography ended. Jin-seok stepped out before the driver could reach the door, his long strides carrying him toward the elevator without a backward glance. The hand that had spent 3 hours claiming her was now tucked firmly in his pocket, as if he needed to hide the evidence of their contact. Upstairs, the penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadow. Neria kicked off her heels, the cold marble floor a sharp contrast to the suffocating warmth of the gala. She didn't head for the guest room tonight. Instead, she followed him into the master suite, the bedroom in name only. Jin-seok was already at the sideboard, pouring amber liquid into a crystal glass. He had discarded his jacket and loosened his tie, but his back was a rigid wall of muscle. "You were perfect tonight," he said, his voice flat, devoid of the practiced charm he'd used on the mayor an hour prior. "I've had 18 months to rehearse," Neria replied, leaning against the doorframe. She watched the way the moonlight caught the edge of his jaw. "Tell me, Jin-seok, does it ever hurt? The transition?" He took a slow sip of the whiskey, his eyes fixed on the city skyline. "I don't know what you mean." "The way you turn it off," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "In the car, you touched me like I was the only thing keeping you upright. And the second we crossed the threshold of this house, you looked at me like I was a stranger you were forced to share an elevator with. It's a violent shift. I wonder if you feel the whiplash as much as I do." Jin-seok finally turned. His dark eyes were sharp, unyielding, and buried deep within them was a flicker of the hunger he spent every waking hour suppressing. He looked at the way the silk dress clung to her, the way her shoulders slumped with the weight of his distance. "The world needs to see you as mine, Neria. It is the only way you stay safe." "Safe," she echoed, a hollow laugh escaping her. She walked toward him, stopping just outside the circle of his personal space. "Is that what this is? You think a cold bed is a shield? You think that by refusing to look at me when the doors are closed, you're keeping the monsters away?" He set the glass down with a controlled click. "I think that if I allow myself to want you in the dark, I will lose the clarity I need to keep you alive in the light. My touch in public is a warning to others. My touch in private, that would be a confession to myself." He stepped past her, the scent of sandalwood and whiskey trailing in his wake. As he reached the door, he paused, his hand gripping the frame so hard his knuckles turned white. He didn't turn back. He never did. "Go to sleep, Neria," he commanded, the low precision of his voice marking the end of the conversation. The door closed, the sound echoing through the vast, empty room. Neria turned back to the window, watching the city bleed light. She was safe, perhaps. She was protected, certainly. But as she stood in the center of their untouched room, she realized that Jin-seok's discipline was a cage far more effective than any prison his enemies could build. He had mastered the art of possession, but he had forgotten that a woman who is never touched eventually begins to feel like she doesn't exist at all. The silence of the penthouse had a physical weight to it, a pressurized density that seemed to swallow sound before it could even form. In the weeks following the gala, the quiet became Neria's primary companion. It lived in the corners of the vast, minimalist kitchen and settled like dust over the silk sheets of her solitary bed. Jin-seok was a ghost of motion, a scent of citrus and gunpowder in the foyer at dawn, a low-frequency hum of a phone call behind his office door at midnight. He provided everything a woman could want: diamonds that caught the light like trapped stars and a wardrobe of couture armor. Yet he provided nothing she actually needed. Neria began to realize that she was fading into the decor. She was becoming just another piece of curated art in Jin-seok's collection, valued for her placement and her silence. The realization brought with it a cold, sharp spark of defiance. She didn't want more jewelry. She wanted a purpose that didn't involve standing 2 inches behind a man who treated her like a radioactive secret. She found it in the forgotten grand piano at the end of the North Gallery. It was a beautiful, obsidian instrument, its lid closed like a coffin for 18 months. When she finally lifted the fallboard, the scent of aged wood and felt drifted up, a relic of a life before she became the wife. "I'm hiring a tutor," she told Jin-seok one evening. He was standing by the bar, his back to her, the line of his shoulders tight enough to snap. "You already know how to play," he replied, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. He didn't turn around, but she felt his focus shift entirely toward her, that heavy, watchful gravity she had grown to crave and loathe in equal measure. "I know how to read notes," Neria said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to learn how to make it mean something. I need something in this house that isn't a performance for your associates." A long pause followed. Jin-seok took a slow sip of his drink, his reflection in the dark window unreadable. "Fine. Send the security team the details. They will vet whoever you choose." The change arrived 3 days later in the form of Jihan. When the elevator doors opened, the sterile atmosphere of the penthouse seemed to ripple. Jihan didn't carry the stifling aura of the men who usually occupied this space. He carried a leather satchel and a smile that felt startlingly, dangerously human. He was younger than Jin-seok, his presence defined by an easy, open warmth that Neria had almost forgotten existed. "Mrs. Jean?" he asked, his eyes meeting hers with an unfiltered directness that made her breath hitch. He didn't look at her with the fearful respect of the guards or the cold calculation of her husband. He looked at her as if she were a person, not a symbol. "Neria," she corrected softly. The first lesson was a sensory shock. For the first time in a year and a half, the silence of the penthouse was shattered. The notes were clumsy at first, sharp, discordant stabs of sound that echoed off the marble walls. But they were loud. They were a declaration. Jihan sat beside her on the bench, his proximity a radical departure from the choreographed distance Neria was used to. He didn't hesitate to reach out, his fingers briefly brushing hers to correct her hand placement. "You're holding too much tension here," Jihan said, his voice a gentle contrast to the sharp edges of her life. "Music isn't about control, Neria. It's about release. If you fight the keys, they'll never sing for you." Neria looked at his hand, relaxed, available, and steady. For a moment, she felt a dizzying sense of vertigo. In this house of stone and secrets, Jihan was a sudden burst of color. High above them, on the glass-railed mezzanine, a shadow moved. Jin-seok stood in the darkness of the upper hall, his hands buried deep in his pockets. He didn't interrupt. He didn't make a sound. But as he watched Jihan's hand hover near Neria's, the deceptive calm of his face fractured. The silence of his home had been broken, and as the first true melody began to rise from the piano, Jin-seok realized with a jolt of primal fear that he wasn't the only one listening. The heavy silence that Jin-seok had spent 18 months cultivating was under siege. From the shadows of the upper mezzanine, he watched the scene below, his hands deep in his pockets, his body as still as a statue carved from obsidian. The penthouse was designed for silence, for the cold efficiency of a man who dealt in life and death. Yet now it was filled with the bright, erratic notes of a piano and the low, melodic hum of a stranger's voice. Below him, Neria sat at the grand piano, her profile illuminated by the late afternoon sun. Beside her sat Jihan. The tutor was leaning in, his posture open and relaxed, a stark contrast to the rigid, defensive geometry of Jin-seok's own life. Jin-seok watched as Jihan laughed at something Neria said, a sound that felt like an intrusion in a space that had known only whispered strategies and polite, hollow agreements. But it was Neria's reaction that made the air in Jin-seok's lungs feel thin. She was smiling, not the practiced, porcelain smile she wore at galas, but a genuine, messy expression of delight. Her shoulders, usually held with the tension of a woman walking through a minefield, had dropped. She looked unarmored. She looked soft. She looked like she was enjoying a life he had never permitted her to have. Jin-seok felt the line he had drawn, the safety of his emotional distance, beginning to blur at the edges. He had told himself that by not touching her, he was keeping her invisible to his own heart, and therefore safe from his enemies. He had believed that possession was a legal and public fact, one that didn't require the messy reality of shared laughter or private warmth. But watching Jihan reach out and gently tap the back of Neria's hand to guide her rhythm, Jin-seok felt a primal, jagged heat bloom in his chest. It was jealousy, sharp and humiliating. He had spent 540 days denying himself the right to touch her skin in the dark, only to watch a man he didn't know do it in the middle of the afternoon. Again, Jihan encouraged, his voice drifting up to the mezzanine. Don't think about the notes, Neria. Just feel where they want to go. You're too used to following rules. Let the music be the one thing you don't have to control. Neria nodded, her eyes bright with a focus Jin-seok realized he hadn't seen in months. She began to play again, a slow, melancholic piece that seemed to pulse through the floorboards and settle in Jin-seok's bones. It was a beautiful sound, but to him, it was a siren's call, warning him that the fortress he had built was failing. He stayed in the shadows for 7 minutes, counting the seconds by the thrum of his own heartbeat. He watched the way Neria's eyes flickered toward Jihan for approval, and the way Jihan offered it freely, without the conditions or the choreography that defined Jin-seok's every move. He realized then that his restraint wasn't just a punishment for himself. It was a vacuum. And into that vacuum, life was beginning to rush. He had thought he was protecting her by keeping her at a distance, but as he watched her lean toward the light of another man's presence, he understood the terrifying truth. He had made her so hungry for connection that she had become vulnerable to the first person willing to offer it. His jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together until his head ached. He wanted to descend the stairs, to dismiss the tutor, and to reclaim the silence. He wanted to put his hand on Neria's back and remind the world, and her, who she belonged to. But he remained frozen. To move was to admit he was watching. To admit he was watching was to admit he cared. And in Jin-seok's world, caring was the first step toward a grave. He turned away just as Neria hit a perfect chord, the sound echoing like a victory through the empty halls. He retreated into the darkness of his office, the melody trailing him like a ghost, mocking the cold, silent safety of the man who owned everything but held nothing. The following evening, the piano was silent, but the air in the penthouse remained charged with the residue of the day's music. Jin-seok sat in his study, the door open, a rare occurrence, as if he were subconsciously listening for a sound that was no longer there. When Neria appeared in the doorway, she wasn't wearing the loose, vulnerable shirt of the nights before. She was dressed in a sleek, obsidian slip dress, looking every bit the Mafia queen the world expected her to be, yet her eyes held a weariness that couture could not mask. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked to the center of the room, her footsteps muffled by the silk rug, and stood before his desk. Jin-seok didn't look up immediately, his fountain pen scratching a final, decisive line across a document. When he finally raised his head, his expression was a fortress of unreadable calm. "The tutor," Jin-seok began, his voice low and clinical. "He is talented, but he is also familiar. Ensure the security team remains present during the entirety of your sessions." Neria didn't flinch. "Is that what you're calling it? Familiarity? Or is it just that he's the first person in 18 months to treat me like I'm made of flesh and bone instead of marble?" Jin-seok's grip on the pen tightened, a small fracture appearing in his composure. "He is a stranger, Neria. He doesn't understand the world you live in. He doesn't understand the price of being associated with me." "And you do?" she asked, her voice dropping to a jagged whisper. She moved closer, leaning her palms against the dark wood of his desk, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You think you're paying the price by staying 10 feet away from me at all times? You think your restraint is some grand sacrifice? It is a necessity," he snapped, the precision of his voice finally giving way to a raw edge. He stood up, his height looming over her, but he didn't move toward her. He stayed behind the barrier of the desk, his hands curled into fists at his sides. "If I touch you, if I allow myself to become accustomed to the heat of your skin, I become predictable. I become a man with something to lose. In my world, that is a death sentence for both of us." "You're wrong," Neria said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, though her voice remained steady. "You think you're protecting me, but you're just burying me alive. You've built this beautiful, expensive tomb, and you're watching me disappear inside it. Your restraint isn't keeping the monsters away, Jin-seok. It's killing me quietly. Every night I lie in that bed, listening to the silence of this house, I feel a piece of me go cold. I am starving in a palace." The silence that followed was visceral. Jin-seok's chest rose and fell in a heavy, ragged rhythm. For the first time, the choreography of his control seemed to fail him. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the quiet bleeding she had endured. He saw the longing that had turned into a familiar pain, and the resignation that was starting to look like an exit. "You want me to be reckless," he said, his voice barely audible. "I want you to be mine," she countered. "I want a husband, not a guard. I want to be chosen by something that answers back when I touch it. If you can't give me that, if you're too afraid of your own heart to even hold my hand when the cameras aren't flashing, then you've already lost me. The enemies don't even have to try." She turned to leave, her movements fluid and heavy with the weight of her admission. Jin-seok reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, his fingers trembling with the ghost of a desire he had spent 500 days strangling. He wanted to pull her back, to crush the distance between them, to prove that his blood was as hot as hers. But this self-inflicted punishment held. His hand dropped back to his side, his fingers grazing the cold silk of his own pocket instead of her skin. He watched her walk away, the door closing with a soft, final click that sounded like the locking of a cell. He had kept his discipline. He had maintained his boundaries. But as he stood alone in the suffocating luxury of his office, Jin-seok realized that the price of his restraint was a debt that was finally coming due. The following Tuesday, Jin-seok returned to the penthouse 3 hours earlier than the city's rhythm dictated. He told himself it was a matter of logistics, a cancelled meeting with a dock inspector. But the truth was a jagged, restless thing in his gut. He had been haunted by Neria's words, by the image of her starving in a palace, and he found himself seeking the very silence he had used to punish them both. But when the elevator doors hissed open, the silence was gone. The air was thick with the scent of rain and blooming jasmine, and the North Gallery was alive with the complex, tumbling chords of a Rachmaninoff piece. Jin-seok moved with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had survived a dozen ambushes, coming to a halt behind a marble pillar. Neria was at the piano, but she was transformed. The quiet resignation that had defined her profile for 18 months had vanished. She was laughing, a bright, silver sound that harmonized with the music. Jihan was leaning over her, his hand hovering just above hers, guiding her through a difficult transition. He wasn't touching her, but the proximity was an intimacy of its own, a shared space of breath and focus that Jin-seok had never permitted himself to enter. "There," Jihan said, his voice warm and unfiltered. "You felt that, didn't you? The shift from the minor key. That's where the soul lives, Neria. In the tension." Neria looked up at him, her face flushed and lit from within. Her eyes were wide, sparking with a vitality that made Jin-seok's heart hammer against his ribs like a trapped bird. She looked young. She looked free. She looked like a woman who was being seen, not just watched. The jealousy hit Jin-seok then, not as a flash of anger, but as a slow, rhythmic poison. It seeped into his marrow, turning his blood to lead. He had spent a year and a half convincing himself that his distance was a shield, that by keeping his hands off her, he was the ultimate guardian of her safety. But seeing her glow under the simple, uncomplicated attention of a man who owned nothing but a leather satchel and a piano bench, Jin-seok realized his mistake. He had guarded the treasure, so well he had forgotten to keep it alive. He stepped out from behind the pillar, his presence a sudden, freezing draft in the warm room. The music died instantly. Neria's laughter was cut short, replaced by that familiar, guarded stillness. The light in her eyes didn't vanish, but it retreated, banking itself like embers behind a screen. "Mr. Jean," Jihan said, standing up and bowing slightly. He didn't look afraid, which was a transgression in itself, but he looked aware of the sudden drop in temperature. "You're early," Neria said, her voice steady, though her fingers still rested on the keys as if seeking comfort from the wood. Jin-seok didn't look at her. He kept his eyes fixed on Jihan. "The session is over. My wife has other obligations." "Of course," Jihan replied, his smile remaining kind even as he gathered his things. He turned to Neria, his gaze lingering just a second too long for Jin-seok's comfort. "Until Thursday, Neria. Keep the tempo. Don't let the silence take it back." When the elevator doors closed behind the tutor, the penthouse felt twice as large and 10 times as cold. Jin-seok walked to the piano, his shadow stretching long over the obsidian lid. He looked at Neria, searching for the woman who had been laughing just moments ago, but she had already begun to put on her armor. "You look different today," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "I feel different," she replied, standing up to face him. "I feel like I can breathe." "Does that bother you, Jin-seok? That someone else's presence makes me feel more alive than your protection?" He reached out, his hand stopping just short of her throat, his fingers curling into a fist in the empty space between them. The discipline was still there, the self-imposed rules still held, but they were fraying. The poison was working. He wanted to break the piano. He wanted to pull her into his arms until she couldn't remember Jihan's name. But instead, he turned his back on her, his jaw tight with the agony of a man who was watching his world burn and refusing to use the water in his own hands to put it out. The following Thursday, the silence of the penthouse did not return. It merely shifted form. Neria prepared for the evening's charity recital not with the weary compliance of a wife, but with the focused intent of a woman claiming a piece of the world for herself. She chose a dress of deep, midnight emerald that caught the light like the surface of a dark sea. And for the first time in 18 months, she did not wait for Jin-seok to approve the silhouette. When he emerged from his study, his watch synchronized to the second of their planned departure. He found her already standing by the elevator. She wasn't looking for him. She was checking her reflection in the polished silver doors, her expression distant and cool. "The car is waiting," Jin-seok said, his voice a low vibration that usually commanded her full attention. "Then we shouldn't keep it waiting," Neria replied, stepping into the elevator without a second glance. The event was held at an open-air pavilion overlooking the Han River, a sea of silk and expensive perfumes. As they stepped onto the red carpet, the choreography began automatically. Jin-seok's hand found the small of her back, his touch steady and possessive. But as the night wore on, the heat of his palm felt like an anchor Neria was no longer willing to drag. During the intermission, while Jin-seok was pulled into a tight circle of shipping magnates and city officials, Neria did the unthinkable. She stepped away. She slipped through the crowd, leaving the radius of his protection, and moved toward the edge of the terrace where the music of the river drowned out the buzz of political maneuvering. She stood there alone, watching the lights of Seoul dance on the water. For the first time, she felt the cool night air on the skin where his hand usually rested. It was a revelation. She realized that for 540 days, she had been showing up for a marriage that existed only in the eyes of others. She had been a prop in a play that had no second act, a woman living on the crumbs of a public performance. "The view is better from here, isn't it?" She turned to find Jihan standing a few feet away. He wasn't dressed in the tuxedo of an invitee, but in the simple black attire of the performing staff. He looked human, grounded, and entirely real. "It's quieter," Neria said, her voice softening. "You look different tonight, Neria," he said, stepping closer but respecting the space between them. "At the penthouse, you look like you're waiting for permission to breathe. Here, you look like you've remembered how to do it on your own." Neria looked back toward the center of the pavilion. She could see Jin-seok. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes scanning the crowd with a predatory sharpness. The moment his gaze found her, and found Jihan standing beside her, his entire posture shifted. His face remained a mask of marble, but his eyes flared with a dark, dangerous intensity. He didn't come over. He couldn't. To interrupt her now would be to admit to the crowd that his wife had wandered, that his control was not absolute. Neria turned her back on him, returning her gaze to the river. She felt a strange, intoxicating sense of power. She was existing, without him, in a room full of people who believed she belonged to him. The realization was a slow-acting poison to the life she had known. She wasn't just his wife anymore. She was a woman who had realized that a marriage built on protection, through absence, was nothing more than a well-furnished exile. "I'm tired of pretending, Jihan," she whispered, more to the river than to the man beside her. "Then stop," he replied softly. When Jin-seok finally reached her side 10 minutes later, his hand gripped her arm with a force that was a fraction too tight to be considered affection. "We're leaving," he murmured, his breath hot against her ear. Neria didn't flinch. She looked him directly in the eye, her expression unyielding. "We're always leaving, Jin-seok. But tonight, I think I'm the only one who's actually here." The drive back from the river was a study in suffocating tension. Inside the darkened cabin of the sedan, the city lights flickered across Jin-seok's face, revealing a jaw so tightly set it looked like it might shatter. Beside him, Neria was a statue of emerald silk and cold defiance. She did not look at him. She did not need to. She could feel the heat radiating off him, a raw, frantic energy that no amount of Mafia discipline could suppress. The moment they stepped into the penthouse, the silence was no longer heavy. It was sharp. Jin-seok didn't go to his office. He didn't pour a drink. He turned on her the second the elevator doors hissed shut, his shadow looming large against the marble foyer. "You will not speak to him again," he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that scraped against the quiet. "You will not stand with him in a crowd of people who are looking for any sign of a crack in my foundation." Neria didn't retreat. She stepped into his space, her eyes bright with a fire that had been smoldering for 18 months. "Is that what I am to you, Jin-seok? A brick in a wall? A piece of the foundation that just needs to stay in its place?" "You are my wife," he growled, reaching out as if to grab her, only to pull his hand back at the last possible second, his fingers curling into a white-knuckled fist. "Then touch me," she screamed, the sound tearing through the sterile air of the gallery. "Touch me like I'm your wife. Stop standing there like a guard at a tomb. I stood by that river tonight and realized that if I disappeared tomorrow, your life wouldn't change. You've already perfected the art of living without me while I'm standing right in front of you. You think I don't want you?" Jin-seok's composure finally broke. He moved with a sudden, violent grace, closing the distance until she was backed against the cold glass of the north window. He didn't touch her, but he was so close she could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her own chest. "You think this is easy? Every night for 540 days, I have stood outside that door with my blood screaming for you. I have stayed away until my bones ached with the effort of not crossing that hall." Neria's breath hitched, her defiance momentarily eclipsed by the raw agony in his eyes. "Then why? Why the choreography? Why the distance?" "Because loving you would ruin me," he confessed, the words sounding like a jagged admission of defeat. He leaned his forehead against the glass beside her head, his eyes closing in a moment of sheer vulnerability. "In my world, a man's strength is measured by what he can afford to lose. I can lose my ships. I can lose my money. I can lose my life. But you..." He finally looked at her, and for the first time, the unfair beauty of his face was marred by a terrifying human fear. "The moment I touch you, truly touch you, the mask is gone. You become the only thing I cannot control. You become the sharpest weapon my enemies have ever been handed. If they know you are my soul instead of just my property, they won't kill me to get to me. They'll destroy you. And I will not let that happen." Neria reached up, her hand trembling as she finally did what he had spent nearly 2 years refusing to do. She cupped his face, her palm warm against his severe, unshaven jaw. "You think you're protecting me by keeping me at a distance," she whispered, her voice breaking. "But don't you see, Jin-seok? By keeping me out, you've left me standing in the dark alone. You haven't made me safe. You've just made me an easy target for anyone who offers a little bit of light." Jin-seok leaned into her touch, a broken sound escaping his throat. The armor wasn't just cracked. It was falling away in heavy, jagged pieces. But as he looked down at her, the fear remained. He was a man who had mastered every war he'd ever fought, only to realize he was losing the only one that mattered. He was finally admitting the truth, but the truth was a ghost that could not protect them from the shadows already gathering at the edge of their world. The fragile peace following Jin-seok's admission did not last through the night. The morning arrived with a cold, gray light that seemed to drain the color from the penthouse. They had fallen into an uneasy, wakeful silence. Neria still feeling the ghost of his skin against her palm, and Jin-seok looking as though he had committed a sin by letting her see behind his mask. The rupture came at 10 o'clock in the form of a black courier envelope, hand-delivered to the private elevator. There was no return address, no digital footprint. Jin-seok opened it in the kitchen, his movements mechanical and precise, while Neria watched from across the island, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. He didn't speak as he pulled the contents out. He didn't have to. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a single second. Jin-seok's face didn't just go still. It turned to stone. He dropped the contents onto the marble countertop with a sharp, sickening slap. Neria moved forward, her heart hammering against her ribs, and looked down. It was a series of high-resolution photographs. The first was Neria at the piano, the light from the window catching the lit from within glow on her face as she laughed at something Jihan was saying. The second was from the river pavilion, a telephoto shot of her and Jihan standing at the terrace, their profiles close, the distance between them looking far more intimate than it actually was. But the third was the one that stopped her breath. It was a shot taken through the sterile glass of their own penthouse, capturing the moment Neria had stood by the window in Jin-seok's white shirt, her profile a study in longing and isolation. Accompanying the photos was a single, handwritten note in Korean. "You thought if you didn't value the treasure, we wouldn't notice it was unguarded," the note read. "But a hungry woman is the easiest lock to pick. Thank you for the opening, Jin-seok. We'll take it from here." The silence that followed was absolute. The illusion of safety through distance, the grand strategy Jin-seok had built his marriage upon, didn't just crack, it vanished into thin air. Jin-seok's hand trembled as it hovered over the photo of Neria in his shirt. It was the first time she had ever seen him lose control of his physical body. A low, guttural sound escaped his throat, a mix of a snarl and a sob. "They were watching," he whispered, his voice sounding like breaking glass. "Every night I stayed away. Every hour I left you alone to prove you didn't matter." They were counting the minutes. They weren't fooled by the distance, Neria. They were encouraged by it. He looked up at her, and the fear she had seen the night before had been replaced by a cold, murderous clarity. He realized now that his self-inflicted punishment had been a tactical disaster. By refusing to claim her, he hadn't made her invisible. He had made her look like a liability he was willing to discard. He had created a vacuum of affection, and his enemies had moved in to fill it with a target. "The tutor," Jin-seok said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, flat tone. "He has nothing to do with this," Neria argued, though her voice shook. "He's just a teacher, Jin-seok." "He was the bait," Jin-seok countered, his eyes dark with the realization of his own failure. "They knew I was watching. They knew I was jealous. They wanted me to look at him, so I wouldn't see the men in the shadows across the street. My restraint didn't protect you. It just gave them the perfect angle." He reached across the counter, and for the first time in 18 months, he grabbed her hand. Not for the cameras, not for the choreography, but with a desperate, crushing strength. His fingers were cold, but his gaze was a wildfire. The distance was gone, but the safety was gone with it. The war had officially come inside their home. And Jin-seok finally understood that the only thing more dangerous than loving her was the silence he had used to try and prevent it. The photographs lay scattered on the marble island like shrapnel from a detonated life. Jin-seok stared at the image of Neria standing alone by the window in his shirt, the vulnerability of her silhouette captured by a lens that shouldn't have been there. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His distance hadn't been a wall. It had been a target. He had spent 18 months standing on a line of his own making, believing he was playing a high-stakes game of chess, only to realize he had left his queen entirely undefended on a board he thought he controlled. "They saw everything," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, suffocating grief. "They saw you waiting. They saw you hurting. They saw exactly how much I was willing to let you break, just to keep my hands clean." Neria stepped toward him, her hands still locked in his. For the first time, she didn't see the Mafia boss or the strategist. She saw a man drowning in the consequences of his own discipline. "Jin-seok, look at me." He raised his head, his dark eyes fractured and raw. "I thought I was making you a ghost, so they couldn't find you. But I only made you a victim. I let you bleed quietly for 500 days because I was too much of a coward to face the fact that you already were my weakness. Whether I touched you or not, you were the center of my world, and they knew it before I did." He reached out, his hand trembling as he finally crossed the space he had guarded so fiercely. His fingers brushed her cheek, not with the steady, practiced warmth of a public performance, but with the frantic, starving desperation of a man who had finally run out of time. The touch was electric, a jagged current of truth that bypassed 18 months of silence. "I'm done," he said, the words sounding like a vow. "I'm done standing on the line. I'm done pretending that I can survive without the only thing that makes me human." He pulled her toward him, his movements no longer choreographed or precise. It was a violent collapse of distance. When his arms wrapped around her, it wasn't the soft embrace of a lover. It was the ironclad grip of a man reclaiming what he had nearly lost to the shadows. Neria gasped, her face buried in the crook of his neck, the scent of him finally real, finally hers. The loose white shirt she wore was crushed between them, a bridge of fabric finally burning away. "You're going to be a target regardless," she whispered against his skin, her tears wetting his collar. "If we're going to be in danger, Jin-seok, don't make me face it alone anymore." "Never again," he promised, his voice a low, terrifying growl of intent. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands cupping her face with a possessive ferocity. The fear was still there, flickering in the depths of his eyes, but it was no longer a reason to retreat. It was fuel. He realized now that strength wasn't the absence of vulnerability. It was choosing what mattered most and defending it without apology. He had spent his life building a fortress, but tonight, he realized the only thing worth protecting was inside his arms. He leaned down, his mouth finally finding hers in a kiss that tasted of whiskey, salt, and 18 months of repressed hunger. It was the end of the performance and the beginning of the truth. The penthouse was still silent, and the enemies were still watching from the dark across the street. But for the first time since their wedding day, the master bedroom door didn't represent a boundary. It was an open gate. Jin-seok stopped guarding the threshold and finally walked through it, choosing to be ruined by love rather than saved by silence. The transition from the performance to the truth was not a quiet surrender. It was a revolution. For 18 months, the penthouse had been a temple of cold marble and stifling discipline. But as the weeks followed the night the line was crossed, the atmosphere began to change. The silence was no longer heavy with things unsaid. It was filled with the low, steady rhythm of two people finally inhabiting the same space. In public, they remained the formidable pair the world expected, but the choreography had evolved into something dangerous and real. Jin-seok's hand still rested at the small of Neria's back, but the touch was no longer practiced or polite. It was the grip of a man who was no longer hiding his heart to protect it, but rather baring his teeth to defend it. He moved with a new kind of power. Not the power of a man who had nothing to lose, but the absolute, terrifying lethality of a man who finally knew exactly what he was fighting for. The rival factions who had sent the black envelopes soon learned the price of their miscalculation. They had banked on Jin-seok's restraint being his greatest shield, believing that by threatening his neglected wife, they would find a man paralyzed by his own internal walls. Instead, they found a monster unchained. Jin-seok dismantled the threat with a surgical, cold-blooded efficiency that left no room for negotiation. He did not do it from a distance. He moved through the shadows of the city with the singular purpose of a man clearing a path for the woman he loved. He stopped treating Neria as a secret weakness and began treating her as his primary directive. At home, the master bedroom was no longer a room in name only. The doors stayed open and the lights stayed low. One evening, Neria stood on the terrace, the river wind catching the silk of her robe. She felt a presence behind her, not the watchful shadow of a guard, but the solid, warm reality of her husband. Jin-seok stepped up behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist, pulling her back against his chest without hesitation. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in, a private touch that was no longer a performance, but a necessity. "Everyone is talking," Neria whispered, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "They say you've changed. They say you've become unpredictable." "I was predictable when I was afraid," Jin-seok replied, his voice a low, rough vibration against her skin. "I was easy to read when I was trying to pretend you didn't matter. Now, they know I'll burn the city down to keep you standing. That makes them hesitate. That makes us solid." He turned her in his arms, his gaze sharp and unyielding, but no longer cold. He looked at her with a raw, chosen vulnerability that was more intimidating than his previous mask of marble. He had realized that strength wasn't the absence of a target. It was being the man no one dared to shoot at because of what he was protecting. "You aren't starving anymore," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her lower lip. "No," she said, her eyes bright with a peace that had been 18 months in the making. "And you aren't hiding." Jin-seok leaned down, kissing her with a slow, unrestrained passion that spoke of a life finally without armor. He had built his world on power and survival, never planning for the messy, beautiful complication of happiness. But as he held her, his wife, his equal, he understood that the line he had drawn had never been for her protection. It had been his own prison. By crossing it, he hadn't become weaker. He had become invincible. The piano in the North Gallery remained, but now when Neria played, she didn't play to break the silence. She played to fill a home that was finally, indisputably theirs. The performance had ended, and the truth, no matter how dangerous, was better. They did not become safe, but they became whole, and in the dark, violent world of Jin-seok's making, that was the only victory that mattered. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to this channel. Your support means a lot. Share your thoughts in the comment section. Like and share with others. Click the notification bell for the next story. Thanks for watching.